Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this session today, where we're looking to understand the way that it is for working as a B2B marketer in a B2C organisation, what the values are, what the benefits we can bring, and what benefits we can glean from our B2C colleagues as well. I'd love to start if we can just go around the table and just briefly introduce ourselves. Give us your name and what your role is. That would be fabulous. So maybe Mark.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Thomas. I work for Hilton as capacity of Senior Director of Marketing Operations, which broadly spans three functions. One is our portfolio marketing, secondly our research and insights, and lastly our CRM capabilities. I've not always been a hospitality marketer. I've worked in retail and in FMCG marketing, so seeing B2B marketing in a number of different guises across those three industries, and hope to be able to add some value this morning.
Good morning, my name is Andrew Buckley. I work for MasterCard and I'm the product leader for our non-card business, which is headquartered out of here in London.
Helen Braum. I work for O2 in marketing operations, and we have a blended ops function, consumer and business. We look after the tech platforms, data and execution of all the campaigns.
And I'm David Daniel. And I run marketing and communications for new payment platforms, which is basically the non-card part of MasterCard.
David's a great name. I'm Dave Stevens. I've been in marketing, B2B and B2C, but probably a bit more B2B for about 25 years. And I'm chair of the Business Marketing Club, which is a network of B2B marketers.
And I'm Richard Robinson. I wear two hats. My first hat is that I am Chief Commercial and Marketing Officer for a startup called DPL. And secondly, I am the chair of the DMA's B2B Council. Well, thank you all very much. What I'd love to do is to kick off and try and understand a little bit around what your experiences have been or observations are around working as a B2B marketer in a B2C organisation. So perhaps, Mark, I'll start with you if I may.
Well, I probably wear two hats, so I'm not a pure B2B marketer in that sense. My work transcends both parts of the function. And I think the thing that I see a lot within Hilton, certainly my most relevant and recent experiences, is just the way that we go about addressing the two disciplines within our planning and our budgeting. Our focus within the marketing department is that about 85-90% of the people there are B2C marketeers. That then takes up the vast majority of the budget and is proportional. And then when it comes to the B2B side of things, even though proportionally in terms of what it delivers to the business, it's around 50-50, we spend a far greater amount of time in the B2C world than we do in B2B. So it's certainly in the planning, the execution, the allocation of resource is definitely the poor relation in that regard.
And from that respect, how does the B2B marketing team feel about that?
Yeah, good question. I think I don't know directly, but I can only imagine that they feel a little bit sort of out on a limb. They work very separately to the rest of the function, and there are a few occasions where they're really integrated in. One of the areas in where there is cross-collaboration is in our partnership strategy. So what starts off as a very B2C focused partnership and alignment with another organisation or a sporting body, definitely based upon the customer interests of our B2C customers and the data and the insight that we bring there, is then leveraged through our B2B teams in terms of hospitality, the expansion of relationships and bringing those parties to the table in terms of discussion for further business in the future.
Okay. Helen, if I can turn to you, I know that O2 have made quite some progress in this area of bringing that together. So what are your observations?
Similar situation in that B2C is much bigger in terms of people, budget, but we have got a unified marketing team, and I guess it's a mix of specialists and generalists. So we have our dedicated B2B people, and then you've got areas of like huge expertise really, say social media marketing, where the majority of the time in that area might be on the consumer side of life, but they also support business. So it's kind of, the boundaries have become blurred, and I guess that's one of the things in a big team. You have such a range of functions, don't you? So you do have more of that traditional B2B generalist, jack of all trades, but it's absolutely amazing to be able to leverage the expertise from like our digital insights teams, our social teams. So in a way, to me, those walls have come down. It's more about job roles and what you're doing. And some people have got a business outlook, some people consumer, and some people both. Majority still being consumer, because that's just the reality. But the silos do get in the way, you know, in a corporate, and different priorities get in the way. But that's kind of part of corporate life, I suppose. Mm-hmm. I don't see it as being unique. You know, as a B2B marketer, I've got to, you know, get people on side and get people supporting my projects wherever I was working, really.
Okay, interesting. And David, from your perspective, I know that you've worked in some of the largest brands. And what was your experience in terms of that B2B and B2C and how that?
Yeah, and as I actually had the privilege of working on both sides, on B2B and B2C. So the B2B at Barclaycard, B2C at Lloyds Banking Group, and obviously now B2B at MasterCard. So I think the experience is similar to Helen's very much. With MasterCard over the last few years, the B2B function has grown tremendously. The CMO is very interested in what B2B do and how we do it as well. And so it seems like we definitely have everything to play for. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the expertise that we can access, right? So in the global team that has, you know, you name it, you know, social media, there is a wealth of expertise that we can basically tap into and borrow and steal from in order to use that for the B2B world. So that's been working very well. I think the discipline has been growing. In terms of, you know, things that we always reiterate and focus on is the fact that actually at the end of the day it's human to human, right? So we try to make sure that we dispel the whole division between B2B and B2C. I'm actually just saying, well, at the end of the day you're still interacting with a human being. So therefore let's think about how you make them feel, how you help them become a hero within their organization or within their life, and how do you make sure you touch those sort of emotional as well as rational points. To make sure that they actually end up either converting or doing something that you would expect them to do.
Interesting. I mean, interesting on the human-to-human piece, which I completely agree with, but I often use the example of when I'm in B2B buying mode for my business. I use the example, if I went out and bought a very bad pair of jeans, would I get home and be fired by my wife? Possibly not. If I went and made...
She might not allow you to come to dinner.
No, exactly. But in terms of if I'm buying for my business, I mean, there's something really critical about that could actually have a very detrimental effect on my business and also my career.
Absolutely agree, and I think it's, you know, you need to engage with both sides of the brain, right? It's not enough to just emotionally convince people. But you do have to think about actually what is it that will give them everything they need to then rationalize that this is the right decision, that, you know, you are the best partner. And yes, it's probably less about value and more about the expertise that you bring to the table, but it's still very much an emotional decision. You know, the first time I really thought about this was when I was at Barclaycard, and we would walk into a room to pitch to senior execs to sell them business, and out of 10 people in the room, 6 of them had a Barclaycard in their pocket. And probably 9 out of 10 would have seen the water slide ad, right? Mm-hmm. And so you were coming in at an advantage already to anybody else who was coming to pitch that was an unknown brand. And I think it's leveraging that emotion, and then capitalizing on that, making sure that you have the same or similar messaging, and then injecting the expertise, the value that you bring to the table, as well as the relationship, because again, that's what it's all about.
Fantastic, thank you. Dave, your experience, again, you've worked in both B2B and B2C and organisations that do both. What are your observations?
I think David's right. I don't think there is actually that much difference between B2B and B2C. We're all humans. We all have to market using emotion, and that applies in both environments. I think there are 2 differences. I think B2B tends to have a longer sales cycle generally than B2C, which makes things like proving return on investment so much more difficult. And I think the second thing is the decision maker units tend to be larger, although even in B2C I think you do quite often have purchases that involve more than just one person in terms of the decision making, but they tend to be slightly larger in B2B.
So you've met my wife then, and my decision on clothing.
She doesn't approve.
No, absolutely. They're pretty bad. Andrew, from your perspective, I think I'd love to know your view, because you're part of the executive team. What are your observations about what works and what doesn't work, what has worked and what hasn't?
Yeah, so I've spent time working in marketing, mainly B2B. But stepping outside that and looking at some of the executive or board type discussions I've had in previous companies, I have heard this frustration at the executive level of the silos between B2B and B2C. And I think those, for those people at the sort of the leadership level, and they're looking at these two parts of the organisation, I think the frustrations come in sort of three areas. I think, first of all, I've heard frustrations about the use of assets. So, for example, a long time ago, I worked for British Telecom, and there was a lot of investment in sponsorship assets by the consumer side of the business. But the B2B marketing team, I think, sometimes struggle to effectively capitalise upon those to push the B2B agenda, and so I hear that sort of frustration. I secondly hear the frustration about the sometimes different marketing messages. So I think you're absolutely right, David. You know, the example from Barclaycard where you go into a room and everyone's seen the slide advert. I used to work for American Express, and there was a lot of effort that went into trying to reinforce the messages from B2B and B2C. But equally, I've worked in other places where that's a real challenge, and sometimes the consumer message has a dissonance with the B2B message, and so when you're in a B2B sale, that's a challenge. Or the consumer business is trying to attract a certain consumer, yet another B2B partner that the B2B side has partnered with perhaps has a message that doesn't overlap hugely well. And I think the third area is about finding synergies, and I think this is the most common frustration I hear, that how do we, as a consumer marketing team, leverage the partnerships that the B2B team have? How, as a B2B team, do we leverage the consumer data that we have? How do we think about the consumer experience? If I could briefly tell an anecdote, I had to go and pitch for some business at BT, a big business customer, and we went in to see some very senior people at a UK bank. And we were there pitching this sort of piece, and one of the execs came in for the final handshake at the end when we hoped to, put forward our final pitch. And that weekend, a BT engineer at this gentleman's home had dug a trench across his lawn, which we looked into. It was absolutely necessary. It was a cable that supported a number of critical infrastructure, so hospitals, etc. So they had to dig the trench. But as you can imagine, the gentleman was not hugely happy about his flower bed with a BT truck going through it. And so I think, thinking about the synergy and thinking about coordination is the third area that I'd highlight. So it's the sharing of assets, making the messages really add up, 1 + 1 = 3, and then finding those synergies.
Fantastic, thank you. A number of you have talked about the fact that, if I summarise, marketing is marketing and there's very little difference between B2B and B2C. I'd like to dig into that a little bit more, because maybe I'm sitting on a slightly different side of the fence, where I think there are some critical differences between B2B and B2C. And Dave, you've mentioned this in terms of the sales cycle, the influencer circle in making a purchase, those types of things. And also things around the way that, in my mind, in B2B, you're building a longer term relationship. Now, I know B2C will say that they are doing that as well. But I'd love to know your thoughts on, are there any kind of differences that do come to mind? Any kind of differences in the way that you're executing marketing that you found work well together with B2C or create some conflict? Maybe Helen, as you're kind of living and breathing this.
I mean, I think it's the similarities outweigh the differences, because you're all, and they're also very diverse, aren't they? They're the sort of convenient labels, but you know, marketing to Soho versus to large corporates, you know, it's a spectrum. So I think, you know, to me, all marketing starts with like the audience, the insight, and of course these days the data that you've got. So I think those principles do really apply across both. But certainly on the consumer side, like the mass market, the huge volumes of data, the mass market campaigns, they have a different cadence, and the decimal point is very much in a different place on those campaigns, which is, you know, it's a sort of a brain stretch when you come from B2B like me. And this is more sort of like the feel of working life, but I think one of the great things on business side is, yes, it takes longer. There's a buying circle, and it's a long consideration period for these huge purchases. But you get very direct feedback from salespeople. That's a big part of B2B marketing, isn't it? And in some ways, you have that customer connection because you've got a very motivated, experienced person in the form of sales guys giving you that feedback. So yeah, I think the cadence and timescales are different, and dare I say it, it's really hard in B2B to measure performance. It's not easy in consumer, but I do think it is really hard in B2B because there's so many people involved in decisions that go over such a long time. So you know, tracking that, and there's multiple contact points.
So it's far more difficult than, you know, you run a campaign for 2 months and you can see the number of sales that are increased, which, I mean, in my experience working at places like Google, you turn on your campaigns here and you can measure that in a B2C way very, very quickly. Yeah. In B2B, as you say, it's more complex, more difficult, more nuanced, I suppose, from doing that. Hence the reason why I guess you have so much interaction with the sales team, you know, telling you what is and isn't working from their perspective. David, do you have any thoughts on this in terms of that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a quick thought that just came into my head on the back of the measurement side, right? Because obviously, yes, it's more difficult to measure. I think it's you need to do a lot more attribution than you would otherwise, but it is possible. So, you know, for example, we've run around our events, we check our website traffic, and it does tend to double or treble on those days. And if the call to action at the event is come and check out more information on our website, you know it's working, right? But it's not as precise a science as showing an ad and then seeing how does that track in terms of sales and everything else in a B2C world. But that's besides the point. In terms of differences, I think the differences in B2B, you have the size of the prize is very different, right? So if you sell, say, a mobile phone, the contract's £50 potentially, or £100 even in best of cases. In the B2B space, you're looking at sometimes 10 million, sometimes a lot more than that, right? And so therefore the size of the prize is significantly higher. You're able to do far better targeting in B2B than you are in B2C. Yes, we all talked about in B2C you can target and all that, but you never really know who you're interacting with, right? In B2B, you could actually go as far as putting an out-of-home billboard outside of the headquarters of the organization you're targeting, right? I'm sure some of us have done that before, and I'm a culprit here. You know, you can actually, you know, go on LinkedIn and specify down to the level of the C-suite or what titles you want to target. It comes at a price, but you can target all of them with the right messages ahead of time, at the time, around the pitch, you know, all that. And I think the final one is that in B2C, it's very easy to see what your competitors are doing, right? Because again, you can just look up what the offers are in the market. You're a consumer yourself. It's very easy to stay up to date. In a B2B world, that becomes very difficult. So conversations with our sales or product colleagues are extremely important because they have a little bit more insight. But in most cases, you will not see how somebody else pitches to the potential buyers. And I think that makes it very difficult because you're always striving to be the best without really knowing what the best is.
Interesting points, and if I could just pick up on the measurement and I guess the planning as well, Mark, because that's kind of in your area, I believe. Do you see any major differences in the way that marketing is planned and measured between B2B and B2C?
I agree with a lot of the sentiment around the table in terms of the process is very, very similar in both functions. And a step that we took as an organisation about 2 years ago now was to introduce the role at a very senior level of the Chief Customer Officer. That was a drive to really take a single view of the customer, all the different touch points, and really links into some of the comments that have been spoken about in terms of your tone of voice, your visual identity, the recognition that the customer has got two guises themselves. One could be in our world, their leisure self, and they're going away at a weekend with family or friends, or they're travelling for business during the week. So it was very important to unify those two things, because historically we would have tried to have a different tone of voice and a different iteration of ourselves for these two customers, but actually their values were the same. But there were some very different and subtle product differences that we needed to introduce. So once you'd taken that single view of the customer, it really was looking at the experience that they would have within the hotel. And it probably comes as no surprise, and you can put your own hats on in terms of how you are Monday through Friday versus the weekend. There's a different level of expectation, there's different pressures. There's different pressures for us in terms of the breakfast bar is absolutely rammed between sort of 6:30 and 7:30 on a weekday. At the weekend, it's much later. How do we set ourselves up to serve those two types of customers, but recognizing that they are the same person? And I think that's where, or for us, this is where the B2B world can start to add some real value for us, because ultimately within a hotel operation, your loyalty program is really giving you more data about the customer in their business guise and their business self, because that's typically where you're having the most interaction with them. Now, we use some of that data to understand what's going to be important to that guest on arrival, how we want to set the room up, is there anything that they typically want in terms of services in and around the hotel when they arrive. But then we can use some of that data that we've harnessed through that in the B2C world. And I think one thing that hotel companies need to be very cognizant of that I've started to see is thinking that actually your loyalty program is a B2C platform. For me, it's really ingrained in B2B, because that's where you get the most of the data from. And actually, when we're then having conversations with all of our clients, it's, can you give all of your team one of our loyalty cards so that we can learn more about you and improve the service for you? But that then really enriches the B2C team. So in that instance, the B2B team really can recognize and leverage the value that they bring to the table. It's directly measurable. We can get that data on a weekly basis to see who, what, where and why that customers are staying. And really gives us the insight in the B2C world to go and then start the cycle again and plan our marketing in terms of that single customer view, as I say.
That's fascinating, because certainly in my mind, loyalty cards have been very much based around my interaction as a consumer rather than the business. But I think what you're saying is that the majority of a high percentage of your loyalty card holders are using it because they're business travelers, and then you're leveraging that data back in. So that's a really fascinating observation, and something that I'm not sure many other businesses are looking at.
And we continue to grapple with that internally as well, because as I say, we'd started with this move towards a chief customer officer and the single view of the customer to say, well, actually the loyalty program is a B2C program. Well, it's not. It really is ingrained in the B2B world, and then becomes the common currency from which we can take out to partners who we're looking to have strategic alliances with, because we can see if our customer is the same as yours, and what value is there of the two of us joining forces.
Absolutely. And Andrew, I know you touched on this a moment or two ago, but we've started to come up with that kind of brand consistency issue there. Do you feel that how important is that? Or do you feel that if you have a B2B product, it needs to be more professional? Or do you feel there's an overarching brand that can work for both?
I think it goes back to the difference between B2B and B2C. So there's some really good research that B2B decision-making units, a lot of what drives a consensus decision is having a consensus view of the brand. So in other words, if you come to the final meeting and we're going to choose supplier A, supplier B, there's academic and business research that if around the table a majority of people have a common view of the brand, they're the most innovative, they're the fastest, they're the cheapest, they're the most reliable, whatever, if there's a common view of the brand, that the group will tend to choose the one that has the most consistent brand view rather than necessarily the one which on the spreadsheet is the best. So there's some good research that B2B branding is about consistency. And so that really brings into mind this alignment between the business and the consumer brand, because some of the people in the decision-making unit perhaps haven't been involved in the B2B bid. To your point about the hotel, Shane, you get the travel procurement person, and then they have to make a decision around the table. There's probably a finance person, the head of sales or engineering who has the field engineers on the road. And if they have a common view on the Hilton brand or whatever the brand is, the research is that they're more likely to pick that provider. And so therefore being able to reinforce a consistent brand story that you also have for the B2B channel is in my view really critical, but not something that I see done as well as it could be in my different roles in different companies.
Interesting. I mean, I had the privilege of working for Google for a number of years, and we found which is basically a B2B company, although everyone sees it as a B2C business. And we saw the fun, innovative, really great brand that it had in a consumer perspective actually had a negative impact on those boardroom conversations when you're trying to sell enterprise-based products, because people thought, well, I know Google because of this. Can I trust them to look after my data online in a cloud environment, that sort of thing. So it's quite interesting how that you can have a great brand here and it can negatively impact.
And there's a real nuance. So I launched the Business Centurion, the black card, corporate Centurion in the US many years ago. And there's a subtle difference between the consumer is the multi-$1,000 a year titanium card. So the consumer brand and the consumer audience is very different, but this was a card that we gave to the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. But we're able to leverage a lot of the assets from the consumer business for this B2B product. But we're also able to take some of the values from the B2B brand and used in the B2C brand and used in the B2B brand. And that sort of reinforcement that when we're in the B2B pitch, that we can support all levels of your organization, but with a twist. So the consumer one is all about having access to, the restaurants, the parties, or whatever. But we managed to sort of link that to the B2B Centurion brand, which was very much around, we enable your CEO to be effective, because it's not about giving him rewards. It's about giving him what he needs to be dignitary, was the word we found through the research. They in many cases, for example, they'll need a suite at a hotel, not because they want a suite because they're a pop star, but because they have the PR people coming in to give them a briefing before going on a round table. And they don't want to have a briefing in their bedroom. That's inappropriate. And so taking that brand and building upon it, we felt was a real breakthrough for us when we launched that product. But it's not easy, and I'm sure we all sort of struggle with that.
Absolutely. So Dave, I mean, with Andrew mentioning the word dignitary, you came front of mind to me. And so
Your briefing this morning in the suite.
No, it was in my bedroom.
So what are your thoughts about this and I know that you're passionate about building brands. I mean, what are your thoughts about this brand consistency and how that can impact?
I think B2B and B2C brand have to work together in order to be able to be effective in the marketplace. I worked at British Land for 5 years, and we started out with a very siloed approach to the way we handled B2C and B2B. So we kept retail separate from offices for a couple of years, and we were forced to bring those two parties together quite simply because it was confusing the marketplace. What we were saying in retail wasn't consistent with what we were saying within offices, and it began to affect the sale. We also found, incidentally, by bringing them together, that there were very, very many benefits. Each B2B marketers could learn from B2C marketers. Each kind of brought slightly different skill sets. You know, the B2B people brought great expertise with stakeholder management, with understanding the fuller customer life cycle. The B2C people brought, I think, a stronger understanding of the emotional impact of what they were doing. And so working together had a real positive benefit for us.
That's really interesting. I mean, touching on the different skills coming together, and you mentioned stakeholder management. Certainly, I've had the experience of, well, in a B2B environment, and Helen mentioned this before, it's like they've got multiple stakeholders, including the sales team.
Yes.
And in so many B2B organisations, or certainly smaller ones, marketing actually reports directly into sales, which in a B2C, marketing seems to have more of a voice at the table, I guess. I mean, are those experiences that you've got, Mark, from this side?
Yeah, very, very much so. And prior to Hilton, I worked for IHG, and we took the step of introducing, the first step on this journey was a trade marketing function, actually, which was able to be that bridge between the consumer marketing and the business to business. And really looked at the kind of everything that we've discussed around tone of voice, the visual identity, bringing it all closer together so that there was a single identity in the mind's eye of the customer. And I think actually having the customer anchored in the centre of all of these discussions has been really, really helpful. Not only from a marketing perspective, but then it's also drove some of the product innovation within the teams as well. So if I go back to, as I was describing earlier, kind of you take Mr. X in his Monday to Friday version of himself and then the weekend version of himself. Even things as subtle as having the team members wearing a suit and a shirt and a tie during the working week, when I suppose a level of proficiency, professionalism is expected because that's what you're going off to do and you want that sort of mirrored. At the weekend, actually, the tie could be intimidating for families or children who are going to be using the property. So we've really, the anchoring of the customer as the central focus point, I think diffuses a lot of the confusion that we've spoken about. And then, directly in terms of the team, this trade marketing function at IHG really was that bridge, and would be able to glean and bring information back from the sales teams that then could be diffused through the marketing organisation and figure out solutions, and vice versa. They could take the consumer lens, and it was the first step on a journey of breaking down the silos and being able to cross-fertilise the great ideas that you could have across the team.
Okay, fantastic. I mean, one of the things that's coming out to me is the importance of data, and you're using it on one side, on the B2B side, to inform the B2C and vice versa. David, I mean, you've obviously worked in financial services for a long time, and my view is that they tend to be quite rich in data. Do you see that has changed over the years in terms of the way that the data is being used?
Yes, I think so we've seen an evolution, right? We're getting more and more data, right? And I think that's true for B2B as well as B2C. And I think where it used to be that, devil was in the details, right? I think devil's in the data right now, but it's not the data itself, it's what you do with it. And I think that's the most important part, right? Because we're so inundated with data that I can basically pull any type of scenario, any type of hypothesis, and try to prove it in some sort of rational fashion, right? But you have to start thinking about what matters. So if you think about digital, does it really matter how many impressions you get? Because frankly, I can pay for impressions and I can get as many as you want me to get, right? Or does it matter how much engagement you get, which is a far more difficult thing to achieve? But how do you rationalize these with senior stakeholders, with people who might still be traditionally trained and might think actually impressions is all I care about? So it's all about, what is it that you want to measure? And we keep saying, so our marketing team has a little slogan, you treasure what you measure, not to sound like a pirate. And it's all about figuring out what it is that really matters. And then once you establish that that's what you want to measure, well, you treasure it. You make sure that you nurture the goals that you want to achieve, nurture the KPIs, make sure you exceed targets once they have been set. And then you have to explain to senior stakeholders why sometimes you've exceeded targets very quickly as well.
In my world, I think that's called sandbagging.
Well, that's exactly what Andrew called it when.
But again, you touch on a really interesting point there about what you measure, and I know we spoke about this a little bit earlier, but kind of in a B2C world, my experience has been you're measuring either very much at the top of the funnel metrics, so it's basically reach and frequency, or right down, particularly e-commerce companies, right down at the bottom of the funnel, which is the purchase, the conversion piece on that. Whereas in B2B, my experience has been that you need a more holistic view across that, and I know we talked attribution is challenging to do, but looking at that on a more holistic level and looking at the different touch points that are happening.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we do, right? So not only do you have to do it across the entire funnel, there's attribution involved, right? So can we claim that we want to bid because the marketing team did the final bit of it, which is making sure that it's written beautifully, tells a story, and it looks great, and there's a video attached to it, right? Yeah. Is that what pushed people over the edge, or is it actually the branding that we started 3 years ago that has pushed them over the edge, or is it the event that our client has attended 18 months ago that actually introduced them to us? They would have not known about us otherwise. And so it's close to impossible to actually attribute any type of percentage to any of these events, but we do track them. Yeah. So we can tell you that, for example, if O2 are a customer, we can basically say, well, actually, we've met them 18 months ago at an event. We've had a conversation. That's the first. So this and this demo, this is what they've done. And that's where Salesforce as a tool comes in extremely handy for us. We also know exactly, we flag who we've communicated with, what we communicated to them. So yes, you can track all of that. But again, it's which bits of that matter.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I would like just to confirm there are other CRM platforms available. But no, I think you're right. And it's about, I guess in a B2C online world, we're tracking, clicks, impressions, visits to website, whereas in a more of a face-to-face environment of B2B, then there are other interactions that need to be tracked as well.
And I think that complexity has consequences on the day-to-day life of the B2B marketer, because I think that means that businesses tend to invest less in B2B marketing than B2C, and B2B marketers have to work a bit harder to, on a day-to-day basis, prove the value of their own existence effectively. How is it that I'm adding value for the business today, and that affects the characteristics of people working in the profession.
That's a really interesting point for me in terms of the characteristics and also the skill set needed in that. So, Andrew, do you, as a leader of business, do you have views when you're bringing people into the business about are there differences in the skill set that you're looking for one side and the other?
I think there's a lot of commonality between the skill set. I think that one of the sort of challenges is, if you go around universities, and I speak at some universities, there is sometimes a perception that marketing is all about the creative element. And I got to do a presentation for some statistics students at a university. And I think I was surprised that they were surprised that there was a big need for analytical skills in both B2C and B2B. So I think there's a real commonality of skills, and certainly as we look to hire people, we look to hire people with analytical skills, with ability to get insights in the market, with comfortable with technology. So I think the skills are common, but I think one of the challenges we face back to this data problem is that sometimes we have people that are not very comfortable with some of the analytics and some of the insights. They have got all the data, to David's point, but perhaps they can't draw out the insights. Or they do some research and perhaps they draw the wrong conclusions. It's very easy to hire an agency and do a quant study that then gives you an answer which you perhaps can misinterpret, or the cynical could suggest twist to give what you want. I think particularly in the telecoms industry, you know, the analytics available to you is, I used to work in telecoms. I helped launch a couple of phone companies in Europe. And we had some real bumps in the road with our segmentation of the customer base. That in hindsight, if we'd taken a perhaps more consumer-centric view, or we'd have better analytics, better understanding of the data, just a real challenge, I think, to get the right kind of mix of people with multiple skills.
Interesting. So I think one thing that's coming out to me is there's a lot of commonality between the roles. Having a mixed team is useful for the skills on specialism versus generalism, those types of things. Which kind of leads to, if the roles are very similar and the skill sets are very similar, how come more people want to get into B2C marketing than B2B marketing?
Someone mentioned the B word earlier, but and it's not the Brexit. Budget.
It's more accessible as well, isn't it? It's the point you made about you can see consumer marketing. You're a consumer of it.
I think that's right. It's all around us, isn't it? Whereas actually you do have to work that bit harder to find out what B2B marketing people have been doing, because it's kind of more targeted. It's more focused on specific individuals, which if you know I'm not part of that segment, I'll never get to see.
Interesting. So we need to raise the profile of some of the great B2B marketing activity that's going on there.
And perhaps there's not actually been much marketing or demystifying of what the B2B marketing world is. It's great to hear that you're getting out to universities and having that opportunity to talk about it, because certainly in anything, I cast my mind back to university milk rounds and the like, and you going and sitting and hearing about the marketing function, the focus of those conversations were very much about business to consumer. And actually, when you look at the majority of agencies in the market, they talk about their business to consumer work. Very rarely does the business to business work come up. So our whole industry and all of our respective functions talk a lot about that part of the discipline.
But I think that's right. But it is something to shout about. There is some great B2B marketing out there. You know, there's if you look at what GE have done, their marketing right now is very much focusing on emotion and the human side of what they do. Dropbox has got some great B2B marketing content out there right now. Zero Airtech. There's loads of really, really good examples out there, and I really think we should celebrate them.
You also got amazing brands like Amazon who do have that brand consistency, obviously hugely well known in the consumer space, but then Amazon Web Services, I'm not saying every person in the street would know about that, but they managed to win in both areas. So, you know, it's hard to get the message over because the consumer's so dominating.
Yeah, and I wonder if how we would have often, or in the past, talked about on and offline marketing and digital marketing. Now it's just very much omni-channel marketing. And I wonder if we're on the crest of something similar, where we're no longer going to be talking about B2B and B2C. It's about brands and it's about customers. And there's subtle distinctions and the differences in some of the tactics that you may use, but it's marketing per se.
It does feel like the world has changed. I think 10 years ago there was much more of a separation between B2B and B2C than I see right now. It feels like on both sides of the marketing divide, we've recognised that there are real benefits in coming together.
Fantastic. So maybe just to close, if I can ask you all just to give one thought about the one thing that you would recommend to somebody that works in is a B2B marketer in a larger B2C organisation. That one tip that you would give them to take advantage of that situation. Helen, maybe I could ask you to start.
Yeah, my one tip would be to drop the jargon. So if you're a B2B marketer and you're talking to a colleague who is from B2C, try not to use terms like ABM, maybe say personalisation, or put it into a language they'll understand. And marketers are good at that because we write briefs and we have to really distill, what we're aiming for. But don't let language get in the way. Drop the business jargon, and try and be really clear and simple.
Fantastic, thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, so if you're in a B2B marketing group, my one ask or suggestion would be try and go and have lunch and with your consumer colleagues and try and find some kind of win, some joint win between the two organisations, some synergy, some common partner, something. Try and find a really breakthrough win. I think that always sells well in organisations.
For me, it would be around taking a single view of the customer and knowing which part of that customer journey or communication cycle you own and really celebrate and champion it.
Dave?
Don't forget to market yourself in the business. You're not just marketing the products and services of the business, you've got to market yourself and your marketing team.
Fantastic. And David?
Just to wrap it up, I'll say steal shamelessly. I think there's a wealth, because of perhaps the overinvestment in B2C over the years. There's a depth of expertise in different disciplines that you might not have access to in B2B. There is budgets, there's all kinds of resources at your disposal. Work closely with those teams and make sure, so to Andrew's point, yes, go for lunch, but make sure that you leverage what's there to basically benefit the B2B side of the organization. And final thought, it's really H to H, right?
Well, thank you all so much for your time and the great insight that you've provided today. It's been a fascinating conversation. I'd also like to thank VocaLink MasterCard for hosting us today and the DMA for putting on this session. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.